My previous video was mainly dealing with the subjects presented in chapter 1 of the Parsons book. Um, Now that we move to chapter 2, um, some of you might be tempted to skip over this chapter because it talks about political philosophy, it talks about a little bit of what is the history of political science over time. And you might ask yourselves, why do we have to deal with this stuff? This is not a class in the history of politics, okay? Well, I think it's very important because the main philosophers and thinkers that are presented in this chapter are all very important to the way that we see political science now. And because, in particular, it's great to see how the discipline has evolved over time and what kind of question people were asking that were alive before us. Okay, so first of all, at the very beginning, Greek thinkers like Plato and Aristotle were thinking more about how politics should be than how politics is in real life. Okay, so Plato was thinking that if philosophers were the kings of our society, if thinkers were the kings of our society, they would be the best suited ones. Okay, we would take private property away from them, they would just be servants of the state, and they would do the best job. Okay, many people today still think that that would be the case. If we had a government by the wise or government by scientists, that we would be best off. Okay, and that's an idea that is completely different from our modern idea of representative democracy. Aristotle, on the other side, was much closer to the way that we think about politics today because he was thinking about many different forms of government. So he talks about a monarchy, he talks about a tyranny where when the monarch behaves like an absolute monarch or like a dictator. He was thinking about a form of representative democracy when the interests of all the people are represented. And then he was also thinking of a form of democracy that is more close to a plebiscite and where the masses just govern in a way that destroys the minority. Okay, which we'll see that Tocqueville took from. Okay, Alexis de Tocqueville, the French philosopher and thinker that came to America. So, other than Plato and Aristotle, who do we need to remember? We need to remember that there were thinkers not just in Western Europe, not just in Greece, but also in China, like Confucius, or in India, like Kautilya, who looked more at how politics was like in reality. Okay, Confucius in particular thought that the emperor was ruling by divine right, but at the same time that if the people thought that the emperor was behaving like a tyrant, well, then he had lost his divine right to govern. Okay, and they could take him down. Same thing, Kautilya. He was the first to say, look at how politics is in reality. Don't just think about the perfect form of government on paper. Okay, and he was the first to understand how power worked. Okay, Niccolò Machiavelli was the first medieval thinker that we remember in the history of philosophy. Okay, he was an Italian, he was a Florentine in Florence. And he's remembered for being a real pessimist because he's the one who thought of a very cutthroat model of politics where people just intrigue against each other and try to kill each other. And so his advice for a prince, for a ruler, for a mayor or a president today was uh, kill other people before they kill you, or something of that kind. Okay, so he's remembered today for being very pessimistic, but he's very important because he can be considered the founder, together with Hobbes, who followed him, of international relations. So of relations between different states, between different countries, as a different realm from just the politics of every day, the politics of a town, the politics of a city, and so on and so forth. Why is the city important in all of this? Okay, the city is very important because until the creation of modern states, which is more or less in the 1800s, cities were the way that people experienced politics the most, and they were the closest to our modern ideal of democracy. Because larger units, such as empires like the Roman Empire or the Habsburg Empire, were normally ruled in a very fragmented way or in a very unitary way with an iron fist by some strong ruler, some strong king or emperor. On the other side, cities tended to be ruled on a more egalitarian basis, also because inside the city there tended to be less inequality. Okay, inequality always gets in the way of true power, of true democracy, of true egalitarian politics. Okay. Okay. So once we leave Machiavelli behind, we can think of a series of authors, of thinkers, such as Hobbes and Locke, that were looking at how monarchy worked in reality, and were saying, well, we have a problem. What do we do without a monarch? Hobbes asked himself. And he answered, well, without a monarch, there is nobody guaranteeing that we're safe. Someone can come kill us during the night because there's no law, there's no police, there's no nothing. And so he was the first one who'd say, well, basically we have a social contract with a king, just like we have a social contract with our president or with our mayor now, which basically says we accept to be ruled by someone, we accept to have a dominant political order above us in exchange for being safe, in exchange for some services. Okay, and over time these services will expand. More and more services. There are many things that we ask the state to do now, not only, for example, fixing a hole in a road, but also, up to a point, education, healthcare. You all go to a public university, so you know what I'm talking about. Okay. John Locke, on the other side, followed Hobbes and took the opposite conclusions. He said, yes, we need a state, but the state has to do very little for us, because otherwise it violates our personal freedom. Okay, so Locke, in a way, he was an early libertarian. He was saying the state has to be as small as possible so that our personal liberties, our personal freedoms are not violated. Okay. The other famous thinker that followed Locke was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. There's a lot on Rousseau in the book. What do we have to remember about Rousseau? We have to remember the fact that Rousseau thought that humanity was inherently good, and he's the first one to put an accent on inequality. Okay, so he is one of the fathers of the modern left. Okay, he's one of the fathers of what would eventually become socialism and American liberalism. Okay, he says we need a government that follows the will of the people. Okay, government and state have been created by the rich to defend their own interests, and they have not created to do the interests of the poor. And so the poor have to take some power back. We need to fix the problem of inequality. Okay? The table at the bottom of page 36 is actually useful to remember the main concepts by Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. So I think that you should take a look at it. Oh, and by the way, just as a reminder, you will have to use one of these authors and the authors that I'm going to talk about in just a second in your first paper. Okay, so by the end of week 2, you're going to have to incorporate the ideas of one of these thinkers. Okay, so that's why you need to understand what the different thinkers were like, so that then you can apply them. And in particular, what you have to understand is the modernity of these thinkers. Okay, the way that they use their own, that their own ideas are used today and have influenced the way that we perceive different ideologies today. Okay?